Greetings, my fellow Americans, and welcome to the latest edition of the Great Montana Conspiracy Podcast. Today I'm actually going to go ahead and divest to something on the national news. I want to remind everyone, I've said this before, but I want to remind everybody that even though these podcasts are actually coming out on Tuesdays and Saturdays, I actually record these the day before so that I can actually get the video uploaded to the internet so it'll be available at 9 a.m. my Eastern Standard Time on each one of those days. So there's no question when it's going to be available, when it's going to be online. There it is. So today, being actually Monday, there was a couple of Supreme Court cases that came down that are very significant and relate to the Great Montana Conspiracy topics that we've already talked about. Specifically, qualified immunity. And that's the topic we're going to talk about today. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled today that two cases that were brought before them dealing with excessive force claims by police officers were justified. That they were justified in being granted qualified immunity, they couldn't be sued, and no wrongdoing or action could be taken either against the estate of one of the people who's dead or against the living person otherwise. I'm going to explain those cases to you and why they're significant, and then I'm going to go ahead and wrap them up into how they relate to the Great Montana Conspiracy. First, there's a case that started on August 12th, 2016 in Oklahoma. Dominic Rawless was the individual involved. His ex-wife Joy, called the police, called 911, said, "My husband's at the house, he's in the garage, he's inebriated, he won't leave." 3 officers show up: Josh Girdner, Chase Reed, and Brandon Vick. Now, the officers are led around the side door to the garage, where they are met by Dominic. Dominic greets them, talks to them. He initially expresses concern that he's going to go to jail. The officers say, "No, we're just here to give you a ride away from here." Dominic feels a little bit threatened, or for whatever reason, takes a step back into the garage, away from the officers. The officers pursue. They advance. Now, mind you, they never come within 6 feet of Dominic, and Dominic never comes within 6 feet of them. It's really important here. When Dominic continued to retreat into the garage, as the officers continued to advance into the garage and followed him inside, he went to the back tool bench and got a hammer. And he proceeded to pick up the hammer in both hands like he was wielding a baseball bat, like he was going to swing this. Remember, they're 6 feet away from the officers. Okay, there's no initial threat here other than the fact he is physically holding a hammer, protecting himself like he's going to swing a baseball club. Now, this is obviously an issue where an individual is using a weapon, okay? But here's where the issue gets a little bit more complicated, because the officers start they draw their guns. Put the hammer down, draw the guns, put it down, put it down. All 3 officers draw their guns. Instead of putting the hammer down, Dominic retreats around a piece of furniture, which puts him in direct line with one of the other officers. He then raises the hammer up higher, which makes the officers believe that he's either going to throw the hammer or he's going to charge at the officers. At this point, one of the officers holsters his weapon and decides to take out a stun gun because, as he later said, he was going to go for the less lethal option. That was Officer Reed. The other 2 officers, Girdner and Vick, decided not to do this and opened fire and killed Dominic. The question is whether the officers were in mortal danger. Was a hammer a justifiable excuse to shoot someone, and particularly shoot somebody with lethal force? These are supposedly trained, armed men. Couldn't they have shot him in the arm, shot him in the leg? Why shoot for the chest cavity? It's just a hammer. Yeah, it's going to hurt. And Officer Reed had the right idea to draw a stun gun. It would have disabled him. It was a less lethal option. The other officers decided they were going to use lethal force. Now, the problem here as well is that this situation occurred because the officers entered into the home, pursued Dominic, and made him feel threatened. They created the scenario and the situation where lethal force became necessary, if necessary is the proper word. They didn't need to use lethal force until they pursued him into the garage, made him feel threatened, at which point he picked up a hammer. He didn't have the hammer when he was at the door. He didn't have a weapon when he greeted them. He was talking with them. He was communicating with them. They could have continued to communicate with him from the door. They did not need to pursue him to the garage. They did not need to draw their weapons. They instigated and they escalated the situation. And then once they'd drawn the weapons, Dominic didn't feel he could back down. He felt even more threatened, and he raised the hammer up higher, and they killed him. The problem is, the Supreme Court, now, initially, the initial trial court said, no, qualified immunity, granted. The appellate court said, no, we see an issue here. They clearly created the situation and circumstance that created the necessity for the excessive force, and therefore they are not protected by qualified immunity. The U.S. Supreme Court came down today and said, no, they declined to decide, quote, whether recklessly creating a situation that requires deadly force can itself violate the Fourth Amendment, end quote. And they said that no prior case, quote unquote, clearly established whether this breached the qualified immunity issue, or the shield protected by qualified immunity. Consequently, they allowed for the dismissal of the case, and the case is done. A man was killed with lethal force for raising a hammer. He was 6 feet away from the officers. He was never at any point in which he could have used, sure, if he had thrown the hammer, possibly, it could have been, and keep in mind, he's drunk. He's not going to be throwing with any accuracy. He's probably going to throw it at the roof, quite frankly. There's a possibility it might have hurt and caused harm to an officer. Okay, no argument there. He was clearly acting unlawfully. No argument there. But was lethal force necessary, and would it have been necessary if they had not escalated it by pursuing him into the garage? The Supreme Court says, doesn't matter. None of those issues matter. The underlying issues don't matter. These officers are protected. Second issue came out of California, November of 2016. And I'm going to try to get some of these names pronounced right. And if anyone hears this and they know the correct pronunciations and I say them wrong, by all means, correct me, and I'll come back and make it a redaction here of some kind to correct the problem. But a gentleman by the name of Ramon Corteluna, he was in a rage. His girlfriend and 2 daughters were barricaded inside their home. The 12-year-old called 911, saying that Ramon was out there cutting up something with a chainsaw, devastating the inside of the home. 5 officers responded, including Officer Daniel Rivas Villegas. Ramon was wrecking the house. There was no argument about that. There was no argument that he was causing problems. When the officers called in to him, told him to come out, he came out. He had a tool in his hand. He was told to drop it. He dropped it. Came out, told to raise his hands. He raised his hands. At that point, one other officer noted that he had a knife in his pocket. As orders were being shouted to him, don't put your hands down, hands up. In the middle of this, he turns towards one of the officers and lowers his hands. An officer takes a shotgun with beanbags, shoots him twice. Once he's been hit with these, he's cooperative again, puts his hands back up. He's told that up to this point, everything's proper. Okay? Everything's proper. Up to this point. He has his hands up. Rivas Villegas says, get down on the ground. He starts to get down. Rivas Villegas pushes him with his foot onto the ground and then proceeds to get on his back, pressing his knee into his back, pulling his hands roughly behind him as another officer comes over and handcuffs him. This is the point where it became excessive. Ramon was cooperating at that point. He was not resisting. He was in the process of getting down, and Rivas Villegas pushed him with his foot to push him all the way down. He then got onto his back, pressed his knee into his back, and held him there for roughly 6 to 8 seconds. The point is, was that necessary? No, it wasn't necessary. He was cooperating at that point. Less lethal, less harmful methods were used. There was absolutely no reason. There's nothing justifiable in Rivas Villegas using his foot to push Ramon onto the ground. He was already getting down. He was already cooperating. He was lying on the ground. He wasn't doing anything. And he gets on his back and pushes his knee into his back. If there's not resistance, if there's no fighting, if there's no attempt to flee or fight back or anything else, violence isn't necessary. And officers are supposed to be trained to know this. And yet, Rivas Villegas decided that he not only did he need to push him down with his foot, because he was probably frustrated with this whole situation, but then proceeded to kneel on him with his back and dig his knee into the guy's back, into Ramon's back. Again, Ramon was on the ground, cooperating, not resisting. Unnecessary. And that's what the lawsuit was brought against Rivas Villegas for. But once again, the Supreme Court came back and ruled that there's no prior case that clearly established that this was unlawful. At a certain point, common sense should break the mold here, don't you think? After all, if you've got people that are saying, you know, the guy's cooperating, you've got 4 other officers there, clearly no one else felt the necessity to push him to the ground with their foot. No one else would need to get on his back with their knee and press the knee into the back. Only Rivas Villegas did. And yet, somehow, the Supreme Court defended him, said it was justified. We had some seriously bad civil unrest in our country last year. Anybody knows the name George Floyd. George Floyd was killed by an officer, Derek Chauvin, who put his knee on his back for 8 minutes. There's enough controversy out there as to whether Floyd was intoxicated, whether he had drugs in his system, or whether, he was resisting the whole time and fought. The video clearly shows far more than necessary force. George Floyd died. A jury of his peers came back and determined that Derek Chauvin was guilty of murder. 22 years for that crime. This happened in May of 2020. These 2 cases that went before the Supreme Court today are both from 2016. That demonstrates the length of time it takes to work your way through the appellate system to get to the Supreme Court. There's a 4-year lead on these other 2 cases. So in 4 years, I can almost guarantee you that Derek Chauvin will be appealing to the Supreme Court. Will his conviction stand with these rulings today? With these rulings today, where the court has said it doesn't matter the circumstances, doesn't matter the underlying reasons, doesn't matter whether it's instigated, doesn't matter whether anything. All that matters is that they are police and they are protected. They can do anything they want. They're police, they're protected. That's a very dangerous line. And I don't know how to express that other than saying it's a very dangerous line to draw in the sand. To allow someone to be above the law to that capacity. That they can say, it doesn't matter if you kick them. It doesn't matter if you shoot them. It doesn't matter if you hang them off a bridge. If you're a police officer, you can do it. Where do you draw the line? Where do you draw the line? In the midst of the protests that emerged from this in 2020, we had police in our country who were driving SUVs into crowds of people. We had reporters shot with bullets, rubber bullets, not real bullets, rubber bullets. We had smoke canisters, pepper spray, pepper balls, stun grenades used against peaceful protesters, or protesters loud, possibly, but certainly peaceful. They weren't using weapons. We had a couple draw their guns on peaceful protesters walking down the road because they didn't want them on their street. But police and law enforcement, I mean, I've seen some horrific videos of people just bleeding. I mean, they're standing across the street from a courthouse, yelling at the officer stationed there, and the officers open fire on them. I see one recording of a guy whose face is bloodied by the attack. Excessive force, unnecessary excessive force. And again, these cases will eventually make their way up, most likely, to the Supreme Court. And what will the Supreme Court say? They're police. Doesn't matter the underlying circumstances, they're protected. That is so dangerous. We're talking Gestapo-style law enforcement here. This is no different than the Nazi police going around and doing whatever they wanted, free of impunity, against whomever they wanted without consequence. Because ultimately the Supreme Court will validate whatever they did, just by virtue of their position as police officers. I mean, there's no argument here. These officers serve a legitimate function. They do. I mean, they serve a genuine function in our society. Police and sheriff deputies, for the most part, probably deserve our respect. I'm not someone who says defund the police and take the police out of commission and throw the police to the wind and we need something else entirely now. No. I believe they serve a function, and they serve a genuine function so long as they're properly accountable within the function of their office. I previously discussed Dave Berger. If you go back to one of my earlier podcasts, I talk about him and I talk about what happened to him here in Kalispell, Montana, where I am. Officers were shielded from his case because of the privacy and communication law in Montana, which says that an individual cannot record a human voice without the person knowing. Berger was a process server. He was sprayed with a full can of mace in his face, not just a few seconds to incapacitate him. Emptied a whole can. His face was blistering. It was peeling off. He was screaming. He was writhing around, trying to get away from this assault. The moment he started writhing and trying to get away, mind you, he's blind at this point. He has absolutely no way to see what he's doing. He's flailing around trying to get away, desperate to get away from whatever's causing this horrendous pain in his face. Officers shouting, "Resisting arrest," and they're bludgeoning him and throwing him on the ground. All this caught on video. This should have been like headlines all across the country, right? Wrong. Because then acting police chief Frank Garner came along and said, "Nope, you can't record this, illegal. I'm confiscating all your phones." And he was right. Because the privacy and communication law in Montana forbid recording of those police officers because it recorded their voices. And they didn't know they were being recorded. And nothing ever happened to them. They were never prosecuted. No charges were ever filed. No investigation. It was just snuffed. Berger went down on federal gun charges, and as I mentioned, disappeared into the woods. When I kind of go along with the theory that someone shot him and killed him and left him in the woods. And when I say that someone, I'm talking about someone in law enforcement, because they could. Even though police and sheriff's deputies serve a genuine function, abuse by these officers cannot be shielded. It cannot be tolerated. There needs to be a zero tolerance policy on that. These officers are trained, highly trained. They go through annual review of their behavior. They go through annual refreshment courses of policy and procedure. These officers are trained. These are not people taken off the street with no idea of what they're doing. These are people who are told exactly what to do, how to respond to situations and circumstances, and then are sent out on the street to act upon those principles they have been ingrained with. So when an officer makes a lapse of judgment and acts off impulse, acts off emotion, acts off his grudges or bigotries, he cannot be shielded. You can't. They have to be held accountable for the harm they cause. In the two cases, one person is dead, another person seriously injured. Both individuals were clearly acting in a criminal manner. The police were appropriate to respond, appropriate to address the issues at hand. One was trespassing, the other was, in a domestic dispute with his family. But in the first case, they instigated it by pursuing him and chasing him into the garage, making him feel threatened. When he picked up the hammer, they drew their guns. Surprise, surprise, he acted even more violent because he was threatened. In the second case, yeah, it can be argued that he didn't quite understand all the commands that were being shouted around him. Don't lower your hands. At the same time, someone's saying, keep your hands up. He's not sure, am I supposed to lower my hands? Do you want me to lower my hands? What do you want? Started to lower his hands. Shot with beanbags. Raised his hands again. At that point, he was cooperating. Instead, he get on the ground. He went to get on the ground, and an officer pushed him with his foot. And then proceeded to kneel on his back for 6 to 8 seconds, digging his knee into the guy's back. For what? What purpose? What purpose does this serve? At what point does violence by an officer become unnecessary? Not only unnecessary, but it crosses the bound of the Eighth Amendment, deliberate infliction of cruel and unusual punishment. Officers, once again, and I cannot emphasize this point enough, they are trained to avoid these situations and circumstances. They are trained. They are told what is allowable, what is not, what is good behavior, what is bad behavior. They are told and trained to be calm and considerate and to examine all situations and not let emotion ride them. When you have an officer pushing someone down on the ground with their foot, a person who is cooperating, that is not a logical, proper response. That is abuse. No officer should be shielded from abuse charges against them. Qualified immunity serves a purpose. Did an officer have justification to arrest someone? Did an officer have a right to even investigate someone who's committing a crime? Yeah, you can imagine the flagrant, every time someone gets charged with a crime, they're going to file a lawsuit against the officer unless qualified immunity protects them. It serves a legitimate purpose, ladies and gentlemen. Not does an officer have the right to hurt or kill someone. The moment that happens, qualified immunity goes out the window. Or it should. We have a Supreme Court right now that's saying no. It doesn't matter what the underlying circumstances are. It doesn't matter whether the officers instigated the problem. It doesn't matter what the situation was. They're officers of the law. They are shielded by immunity. In this case, qualified immunity, but immunity. The bottom line is that law enforcement officers, regardless of the department, whether they be FBI, federal, whether they be county sheriffs, whether they be police officers in a local jurisdiction, doesn't matter. I don't care if they're deputized citizens for an emergency. There has to be a line. There has to be a line. You can't say qualified immunity and just say, by virtue of you doing your job, you can hang someone off a bridge. And agreed, I'm using an extreme example here because that's not what happened in either one of these cases. But what's to stop someone from that? What's to stop someone from pulling up on a noose, throwing off a bridge, and saying, I did it as an officer of the law. He was resisting arrest. I mean, it comes down to that, ladies and gentlemen. Where do you draw a line? I think it's pretty clear that when you draw a line is when somebody gets hurt. When an officer's actions cause harm, whether it be to a person or property. What would happen in the case of Ramon if one of the officers present decided that the only way to get him out of the house was to throw a lighter into the house to torch him out? Would that be protected? Well, according to the Supreme Court, it should. Hey, we were going to flush him out. We didn't think he was going to come to the door, so we threw a lighter and some propane in there. We threw maybe a Molotov cocktail. For anyone who doesn't know what a Molotov cocktail is, it's gasoline with a rag stuffed in the top. It's soaked in gasoline. Light it, throw it through a glass window. It blows, throws gasoline and fire everywhere. The point is, where do you draw a line? And you have to draw a line. And I think it's disgraceful for our country. It's disgraceful for everywhere that this kind of ruling gets passed down from the highest court in the land, because now there's no appealability beyond this. These people have been harmed by abuse by police officers, and the police officers face no consequences. They can cause harm and destruction, even death, without any repercussion. There has to be a line, ladies and gentlemen, and it can't be when someone's being recorded doing it, because obviously there's a state out here, Montana, that won't even let that happen. So in closing, once again, as I always say, if you like what I'm doing, if you like what I'm saying, the information I'm trying to convey, by all means, help support us. The information should be attached to this blog or this podcast. If not, if you're for some reason this has been forwarded to you without that information, please visit me on YouTube, like and subscribe. You can get my videos as they come out twice a week. Or if for some reason you don't have access to YouTube, you can always go to the original source of this material, which is monspiracy.podbean.com, where it's broadcast all across the internet through a dozen different podcast sites. But just remember that you've got to take this information and use it. Not just listen to it, use it. Apply it to your daily life, because this is really important stuff. As always, if you're watching this, please be safe, and whenever possible, please be free. Thank you, and good night.